Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a couple of months ago, for the very first time, we took a look at a channel called Mitsi Studio. They have a very unique animation style, and I really enjoyed the previous video that we did. I'll put a link up on the screen at the end to that video so you can check it out if you didn't previously see it. So we're going to take a look at another one of their videos today. This one is the evolution of the tank. So I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the tank. It's not a real long video, so what I love about shorter videos like this is that we get kind of the most important information, but hopefully if it sparks an interest in you, you can do a deeper dive into that topic. And with that in mind, I can't say too much yet because I don't know how much I'm allowed to say, but I am going to be flying out here in about a week or so to film multiple episodes for yet another History Channel show. So once I know what I am and am not allowed to say, I'll tell you more. I'm still waiting on the contract to come over for that, so I'll see what the details are as far as what I'm allowed to announce. But if you haven't already, you should know that my debut on the History Channel is coming up in just a few weeks on Memorial Day. You'll see the two-part, 4 hours in total, mini-series on the Great War, and I was privileged enough to be asked to take part in that. So I'll be one of the talking heads on the screen for that. That you'll see probably more in the second episode than the first, just based on the topics that I was asked to cover. So we'll see how that all goes. Hopefully it comes out well. I had a great experience, and I'm looking forward to another great experience for another series coming up soon here. So the link is in the description if you want to check out this video without my commentary, or see the other videos that Mitsi Studio has to offer. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Throughout history, men have designed armored vehicles to be used against their enemies on the battlefield.
Yeah.
While the first vehicles with the name tank have their roots going back to the World War I, the idea and the concept of the tank goes back all the way to the Middle Ages, where carriages were converted to serve as breakthrough weapons or to transport valuable goods.
This is a great point that he makes here, is that we tend to think of the tank as being something that was born in 1916, the Battle of the Somme, specifically a place called Flers-Courcelette. During the Battle of the Somme, September of 1916 is the first use of tanks by the Allies. The Allies had a lot of tanks that they used. The Germans made very few of them, but they did have a few, and they would often use captured Allied tanks as well. But the concept, the idea of creating something that was otherwise impenetrable on the battlefield and could be a game changer was always present on battlefields. It's just that with the development of the internal combustion engine and automobiles, this was the natural evolution of those types of weapons.
Some of these carriages would be classed as siege units instead of tanks. That's because of the elements that makes a tank, like its propulsion and firepower, were not yet sufficient in those days. Believe it or not, a V12 twin-turbo diesel engine generating 1,500 horsepower was not a thing yet in the 1500s. For example, this carriage would have had a combined horsepower supply of 1 sad times. Many different designs were transformed into weird-looking shapes, including a design from Leonardo da Vinci, resembling more of a movable teepee tent than an actual tank.
Leonardo da Vinci had a lot of great ideas, but of course the technology didn't exist for his ideas to become a reality. And that's often the case. A lot of times we have ideas for things, but we know what the end point is. We know where we want to get to, but we don't yet have everything in place to be able to take the steps to get there. The moon landing is a classic example of this. They laid out pretty early on, okay, here are the things we're going to have to invent in order to be able to successfully land on the moon. And then they set about inventing those things that didn't exist. So they had the vision already, just not the end result.
With a dozen cannons covering all sides, this was less of a tank, more so a movie set piece for Pirates of the Caribbean. More so, an effective reloadable cannon was also not yet invented, with armies mostly using dismountable cannons to be used as artillery.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few hundred years, messing around with horses and shitty wooden cars, the first serious design of something resembling a tank came in the year 1915. A British Army colonel named Ernest Swinton and William Hankey championed the idea of an armoured vehicle, with conveyor belt-like tracks over its wheels that break through enemy lines and traverse difficult territory. To keep the project secret from enemies, production workers were reportedly told the vehicles they were building would be used to carry water on the battlefield. So, the shipment containers were labelled with the name Tank. I guess it is getting a bit obvious now where the name Tank came from. You're welcome. The first tank prototype was getting the name Little Willie. Yes, a very well-suited name that just shouts out fear, chaos, and destruction.
Kaiser Wilhelm II is the man ruling Germany at this point, so Little Willie kind of smacks of that.
Little Willie was slow, broke down easily, and was bad in crossing trenches.
So, yeah, this is a great picture right here to kind of demonstrate how things evolve. You know, you think you've thought of everything until you realize when you get it into use that you didn't think of everything. So they come up with this concept, they start trying it out, and immediately it's like, oh man, we didn't think about how we get across trenches. So now you've got to devise something that will help you to get across trenches. Well, now the enemy says, okay, how do we change our trenches so that the new ones that can get across trenches can't get across trenches? And you have to deal with them breaking down, and you have to deal with fuel, and you have to figure out that you need infantry support because a tank can't do anything by itself. And so there's constant evolution. There's so much going on here. You're developing a weapon. Then you have to develop the tactics and the strategy and the kind of dictates of the use of that weapon. And then the enemy is going to build responses to that weapon, how to take out this new weapon. So now you've got to change the weapon so that it can't be taken out by that anymore. And then they have to figure out how to take out the new weapon. And so there's constant evolving going on. You see that with planes as well. Airplanes change so much from the beginning of the war to the end, and so do tanks.
Which was a pretty fundamental issue in World War I. By 1916, Little Willie was followed by Big Willie, which had similar issues. Nevertheless, people saw its potential, so further improvements were made on the design of the Big Willie Mark I. This resulted in the first successful large-scale tank maneuver during the war, with 400 tanks capturing 8,000 German troops and more than 100 field guns. With this successful win, the story of the arms race had begun, with Germany developing a new tank model to counter these threats. The German A7V Sturmpanzerwagen, yes indeed, a better name than Little Willie,
It is a better name, but they only made like 20 of them.
emerged on the battlefield. Although the vehicle had a better performance record, the Germans failed in getting a high production number that would make a significant difference on the battlefield.
And why is that? Well, Germany is strapped big time by the blockade of their ports, and so they can't import things. And so they have some things in abundance. Why are they able to make gas during the entire war, for example? Well, they had a big industry that produced the materials needed to make chlorine gas, for example. So they had that in abundance. They didn't have in abundance the materials necessary to be able to make tanks, at least not in the large numbers that the Allies were able to do.
A problem the Germans wouldn't really learn from all the way to the end of World War II. Nicht klug. During World War I and after, many weird tank designs followed, with the Russian Tsar tank basically a giant reversed wheelchair, which was almost impossible not to spot by enemy units. Also, the enormous wheels would have made it very difficult to shoot any of the guns on targets in front of you. You know, that place where the enemy is 99% of the time? The 1917 American-built track-layer Bester wasn't a beauty either. A toppled-over rowing boat with a turret was another weird fault.
Yeah, and the Americans didn't really use American tanks in World War I. We used French tanks. Americans used French artillery, French tanks, French planes in a lot of cases. We got into the war so late, and we were rushing troops to the front so fast that we just had to use what was already there. We couldn't be worried about ramping up our industry enough to be producing large numbers of our own things.
To design. The vehicle was only used for training maneuvers, and its legacy was short-lived, with the vehicle ending up being used to lead parades being covered in posters, probably displaying the text, "How not to build a tank." With the outbreak of World War II, the most prominent tank-producing nations being the UK, Russia, Italy, Japan, Germany and the US joining later in the war, all had very different approaches on their tank designs.
Yeah, and this is all about what do you want it for and how does it perform. And so you have tanks that are fast, but then they might not have as much armor. You have tanks with huge guns, but then they're really slow. You try to build hybrids, and then they end up not being good at anything. And so every one of these tanks has its pluses and minuses, and had its comparable opponent, the ones that it could take out easily, the ones that could take it out easily. And then you had things like anti-tank weapons, which were very fragile in and of themselves, but could be quickly moved and could have big guns that could take out a big tank.
The Italian and Japanese tanks were among the worst of the bunch. If you don't agree, yes, you can leave a comment down below. And no, we will of course not read it. Especially during the closing stages of the war. Japanese and Italian under-armoured and undergunned tanks stood no chance to the overwhelming numbers of Allied tanks.
And this is the other thing that you have to ask is, do we make a small number of very powerful tanks with heavy armor and a lot of protection and big guns, or do we make a large number of tanks and overwhelm with numbers? And it's kind of the philosophy, I think, in the United States, is that we're not making these massive, like, Tiger tanks like some of what Germany had. And they didn't have a ton of them, but we could overwhelm them with numbers, and they just couldn't replace theirs as fast as we could.
The Germans did a better job engineering their tanks, but as mentioned earlier in this video, had problems over-engineering their tanks and could not keep up with the mass production.
Yeah.
Simpler tanks like the M4 Sherman and the Russian T-34 tank.
Right.
The tank-producing capabilities of the US and USSR proved that the Second World War was a numbers game. As long as you were the one capable of easily replacing your losses, your win would be guaranteed. Match fixing to the max. The US-produced M4 Sherman tank was one of the most successful designs of World War II.
Yeah, and not only the Americans, but the British used a lot of them too.
Many different variants being produced. The tank was fast, easy to drive, easy to maintain, and was easy to replace if the tank was destroyed.
And another thing that the Americans had going for us was that we had, because of by nature the United States, the way it's laid out, and with the interstate we didn't have interstate highways yet, but with the long distances sometimes between cities, a lot more Americans as a percentage of the population drove cars than people in Europe did. And so it was much easier transition for somebody to go from having driven a car to start driving a tank and operating, and the production ability of American automobile production to transfer over to making tanks. There was a big advantage for the United States over countries like Germany because of how many people were familiar with building and maintaining vehicles.
Though that last one probably did not comfort the crews a lot. No shame.
Well, yeah.
The USSR designed the ultimate tank of the war, the T-34, and later the T-34-85 hit a staggering production total of more than 84,000 units.
That's crazy.
Which is a lot. You can make your tank as fancy in design as you want. If you encounter 84,000 enemy tanks, you can probably Barbaros all the way back to where you came from.
Barbarossa all the way. Operation Barbarossa being the name of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union.
Humiliation style. This does not mean the Russians did not have their fair share of stupid designs. One weird Russian invention, the Antonov A-40, was basically a set of wings with a strap-on tank to pilot the whole thing. In order to keep it flying, it had to be stripped of all its ammunition, so you ended up with a tank with no ammo.
So we laugh at these things, but a lot of things that ended up becoming game-changing inventions were probably laughed at by people until they were deployed and they were actually really effective. So just because this one didn't work, for every invention that works really well, you probably got a dozen that were terrible.
Great idea. World War II had more weird tank designs, with some being very successful and others being complete shit. The British converted many tanks to be used for the D-Day landings, naming them Hobart's Funnies.
Yep.
You had an amphibious Sherman DD swimming tank. You had the Crab Sherman, used to bitch-slap mines into the air. You had the Crocodile Churchill to flam-cuck the Germans out of their bunkers.
And this is exactly what I'm talking about, is you're coming up with all these ideas to meet particular needs that you have. You say, okay, here's a problem. How do we solve this problem? And your solution might work or it might be terrible, but you won't necessarily always know until you get it into that situation.
Another Churchill variant had a 20-kilogram mortar attached to the turret. Again, something unpleasant to be on the receiving end of. The Germans also had their...
Why would you have a mortar instead of just a regular tank shell? Well, because a mortar is meant to be lobbed up and over at shorter distances rather than being shot directly on.
Special tank designs, with most of them being far more impractical, mostly because of Hitler's over-the-top mindset. An example of this was the development of the Maus tank, a gigantic heavy tank weighing 188 tons and using 16 to 17 liters of fuel for just 1 kilometer.
That's crazy.
Luckily for the Germans, they had plenty of fuel to go around by the end of the war. That was a joke. They did not. And so the Maus tank never saw any action and were found mostly blown up by the Germans themselves.
This just goes to show you that just because you invent something and you have a great idea doesn't make it practical.
If you think the Maus was over the top, say hi to this absolute monster. The Landkreuzer P1000, the latter.
Not familiar with this
a
one.
Battleship, but then on land. Another crazy drug-tripping Hitler fantasy with basically no tactical or military value whatsoever.
A crazy drug-tripping Hitler fantasy. Nice.
The P1000 latter was designed to house naval guns on a giant armored chassis. The project was quick.
That's not that unusual. I mean, naval guns were used back in the American Civil War. They hauled them on land and used them in the siege of Vicksburg. They put big, huge, like naval-type guns on rail cars and used them. So this seems like a natural evolution to that.
Terminated when they found out the P1000 latter would be too big of a target to enemy air units, which sounds also like a too big of an understatement to me. During the last phases of the war, the US introduced the Pershing tank. And after the war, the US further developed tanks. The most numerous were the Patton tanks, after which followed the Sheridan tank.
You'll notice that in the United States, we name our tanks after prominent generals. Pershing, Grant, Sherman, Lee. I don't know if we had a Grant tank. I know we had a Lee. Sherman, Sheridan, Abrams. These are all generals.
The other models, and eventually the tank that is still in use today, the M1 Abrams heavy tanks. They have served in the Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, and multiple other theaters of war. The Russians kept producing new T variants, including the T-54 and later the T-72, followed by the T-90, which are doing great in Ukraine right now. A tank that might perform better in Ukraine could be the T-14 Armata, but for some reason the Russian government has not produced significant numbers of the T-14 yet. Basically, why would you want to send capable tanks to Ukraine anyway? Their tactic is to let...
So you see, they're putting Z on it, and if I remember right, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, because in the war there, a lot of the same equipment is used on both sides, they use the Z to distinguish so you know which side they're on.
Their tanks be blown up, so their flying cupolas become additional artillery to pummel the enemy. Very clever. Maybe in the near future we will see how the German Leopard tanks will perform, or their latest 2022 Panther tanks. By the way, interesting name for a new tank, considering the Germans are always so itchy with everything relating to their past. And yet...
That's a great point, is that Panthers were a World War II tank, and I'm personally fine with it, but I know, like he said, that they're a little... You know, they try not to talk too much about what happened there. I shouldn't say they don't talk about it because, like when I was in Germany, I was in Munich. We went to Dachau, which was a prison camp for political prisoners, a slave labor camp. A lot of people did die there, but it wasn't an extermination camp. And there were a bunch of school groups that were there. So I shouldn't say that they don't acknowledge the past. They don't embrace their military history, especially World War II. They acknowledge it with the hopes of teaching so it doesn't happen again.
They can now just copy-paste Nazi tank names straight from World War II like it's a fucking Call of Duty game. For now, it looks like Ukraine will become more and more the world's largest testing ground for new weapon systems.
That's true.
Both for Russia and the West. It might tell us more if the role of the tank will remain significant in the future.
That's a great question. Is the tank a weapon of the future, or is its heyday behind it? It's kind of like the battleships. For a time, battleships, they were it, and then they weren't when aircraft carriers came along. And now, while aircraft carriers matter, they don't matter as much. Now the small, like destroyers and cruisers with a lot of missiles on them, those are the real workhorses and the powerhouses on the seas. So it changes.
Or will it become completely obsolete? Time will tell.
Yep.
Check out our new store for...
All right, that was cool. I really enjoyed that. Both videos I've done of theirs now, I've really liked their animation style. They do a great job of telling the story while keeping it entertaining and also making it very visually appealing. So I think we'll definitely do some more of those. If there's a particular one of their videos you'd like me to take a look at, let me know in the comment section. And I'll put up here on the screen in just a second some links to some other videos you could check out, including the one that I did of theirs back in March. Thanks for watching.